Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Today's topic is one near and dear to my heart, and that is the education of youth. And what an awful job we're doing today. But more pertinently to today's topic, exploring a little bit what God has said on the matter and why government schools, Caesar's schools, so-called public schools, are kind of a tool in the war on religion, how they historically evolved that way and what it means for us today. I myself am a graduate of the public school system and had a very mediocre education myself and didn't really enjoy it, only discovered learning, a love of learning after all my schooling was done. And I've had to kind of unpack in a lot of ways why that is and just why everyone tolerates such a degraded quality of education. And I don't think that this is intentional. I'm going to get into this in a little bit, that I think this dumbed down nature of the schools and our curriculum is actually intentional and desired by many. But we'll save that for just a minute. Of course, the scriptures are full of counsel from God talking about the importance of education. In fact, I was initially going to title this musing something like, education is of God, Caesar's schools are not, or something like that, right? Because God has a lot to say about education. Proverbs 22, train up a child in the way he should go. Alma talking to Helaman saying, learn wisdom in your youth. DNC 88 saying, teach ye diligently, be instructed more perfectly. Verse 118 in section 88 says, seek ye diligently and teach one another words of wisdom. Yea, seek ye out of the best books words of wisdom. Seek learning even by study, also by faith. Be acquainted with all good books in section 90. The glory of God is intelligence, or in other words, light and truth. That's in section 93. Also to obtain a knowledge of history and of countries and of kingdoms, of laws of God and man, and all this for the salvation of Zion. In other words, the salvation of Zion hinges upon our intelligence, the glory of God. We have to obtain a knowledge. We have to learn. We have to, be educated. Of course, Joseph also said that it's impossible for a man to be saved in ignorance. So education is clearly important. And when the saints first traveled west, of course, they had this kind of quasi-theocratic political rule where Brigham Young was both, president of the church and territorial governor, and it was almost like a, dictatorship of sorts. They had a territorial legislature eventually, and these schools started to pop up because when the Transcontinental Railroad came through, it facilitated transportation, and thus a lot of so-called Gentiles made their way to Utah. And of course, these new citizens of the territory of Utah were very resentful of being governed by basically a Mormon, stronghold that was nearly impenetrable, and that people were voting for the same individuals they were sustaining on Sunday. And it was very, of course, you can imagine if you're not a member of the church and you choose to relocate here for some reason, what that dynamic must be like to be governed by this kind of quasi-theocratic ruling regime. And so there was conflict, obviously. A lot of conflict arose from this wave after wave of immigrants and others moving to Utah. And a lot of these individuals really despised how Mormons were basically, from their perspective, propagandizing their young. So initially, before you had the so-called free schools, government or public schools, taxpayer-supported schools, initially you had other religions, other churches establishing competing schools to try and, from their perspective, unbrainwash all these Mormon kids to try and save them, from their parents. Here was an Episcopal bishop. His name's Daniel Tuttle. And because at the time there were a lot of Protestant missionaries who would come to Utah to try and, save the Mormons and so forth. And so this bishop, Tuttle of the Episcopal Church, he said, he put it this way, adults were fanatics, adult Mormons were fanatics, and so beyond the reach of our influence, or else we're apostates, and so, grossly deceived once, we're unwilling to listen again to any claims of the supernatural. But the plastic minds and wills of the young we could hope to win to better views and mold in nobler ways. This is very similar to what Horace Mann said. Horace Mann was the founder of the Common School movement, extremely influential in the early days of Prussianizing American education, importing this very top-down, regimented, militaristic, command and conquer, conveyor belt strategy into the government schools in Utah. He became the first, commissioner of education, and helped get Massachusetts to become the first state to pass compulsory education laws. Horace Mann was very influential in the early days of America's schools. And he has this quote where he says that men are like cast iron, children are like wax. And that's exactly what this Bishop Tuttle here is saying, that the adult Mormons, they as missionaries could not persuade any of these adults to believe their Episcopalian Protestant faith. And so they focused on the young, the children who had so-called plastic minds and wills to better mold in nobler ways. Of course, this is a broader trend for totalitarian thugs and freedom lovers and everyone in between, which is to always go after the kids. Dictators throughout history have always utilized and desired government education whereby they could propagandize the young. But Brigham Young and all the saints were facing this in early Utah. Here they were trying to teach their faith to their children. All these outsiders are coming in. They're horrified at what they see. They want to basically save the young, and thereby they start setting up these schools trying to attract a lot of Mormon families. Here was Secretary of State William Seward, U.S. Secretary. So this is the federal Secretary of State. He said that these schools established by Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists and Catholics and others in Salt Lake City and surrounding territories, he said that these schools would do more to solve the Mormon problem than the Army and Congress of the United States combined. There was a reverend from a national convention of Protestant teachers. This was in 1883. And he said that there were more than 58 Protestant schools at the time in Utah with more than 3,500 students, boasting basically of how successful they had been. More than half of those students were children of Latter-day Saint parents. But he was very open about what the purpose of these schools was. He said, these schools are all in reality, though not obtrusively, Christian schools. All their teachers are really missionaries, and they do much in the way of personal missionary labor. The preachers and the teachers constitute one consecrated and harmonious band engaged in undermining the whole system of Mormonism. This was very well known to the members of the church, to the leaders of the church, Brigham Young especially, being very open and critical about these schools popping up and encouraging Latter-day Saints not to basically let your theological enemy, or this person who sees you as a theological enemy, not letting them be responsible for educating your kids. Here's another individual talking. This was at the National Assembly of Christian Educators at the time. And so he's demanding that Congress intervene and pass some laws to take all political and municipal power from the leaders of the Mormon Church, calling for them to compel Mormons to send their children to schools that would liberate them from the supposed corruption of their parents. Nothing, he said, but radical measures will cure this disease. The patient has gangrene in the foot. The surgeon advises amputation. So these were the arguments, these were the perspectives of the people at the time trying to set up competing schools. And as more Gentiles came in, it slowly morphed into these free schools, these taxpayer-supported government schools that not only were initially non-sectarian, in other words, they were still teaching God and, the Bible or whatever, right? But just not taking any particular sect's views on the matter. So they were non-sectarian, but then eventually becoming secular and saying, we're not going to have God at all. We're trying to undermine, Mormonism and Christianity by just removing it from the schools entirely. And And so this was very intentional. This was actually desirable. At the time, Horace Mann and all his buddies in the Common School movement, they were specifically trying to homogenize all of the different immigrants, the different populations and cultures that were coming into America. They wanted to homogenize children into one American culture, this kind of collective. They saw as an ideological threat, a political threat, this idea that you would have, Irish Americans and Italian Americans and all these little enclaves where people would gather with their kind of culture. They wanted to dismantle all of that and just have people have like one American standard. They wanted to do so, especially by going after the kids. They were very successful, but that was their model. It was a very anti-immigrant at the time. I mean, immigration, though a long-standing way for America to grow its ranks, was widely perceived by many to be a massive problem. By bringing, poor people over that we'd have to take care of, and ignorant people who would vote, and labor that would compete with American jobs. I mean, that was a massive thing. There was so much racism, in particular against the Chinese at the time, who had come to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, and then a lot of them stayed, and they needed other jobs, and so now they're competing with all these Americans. I mean, in San Francisco, the land of supposed, tolerance and acceptance, they were passing completely racist laws. I document this in Latter-day Liberty, my first book, talking about the racist history of immigration law, or rather anti-immigration law, putting all these restrictions in place. It was 100% racist, and saying, oh, we don't want people from this country and this people from, it was all racism, because before you just had open immigration, and America was the melting pot, and come here and we would welcome people to our shores and everything else. And so immigration law was completely racist. So too was the formation of all these early public schools. Like with Horace Mann and others, they wanted to make sure that the children from all these different communities were pulled away from their parents, pulled away from their culture, pulled away in many cases from their faith. Like take the Catholics, for example. As government schools started to proliferate, they were very Protestant in nature, right? And the Catholics hated that. And so they had tried for a time to get, taxpayer funding for their schools, and much like taxpayers were funding these Protestant schools, and that didn't really go anywhere. So they set up their own private schools, these parochial schools. The bishops would tell the different Catholic dioceses to just start their own schools, and that's why the Catholics for decades have had a very strong private school system, was because they recognized that the government schools were pushing a different theology effectively, and that they didn't want to have to put their kids in there, much like Brigham Young was warning people about the same thing when it came to Mormons. Here's a quote from Brigham Young. "We had to pay our own school teachers, raise our own bread, and earn our own clothing, or go without. There was no other choice. We did it then, and we're able to do the same today. I want to enlist the sympathies of the ladies among the Latter-day Saints to see what we can do for ourselves with regard to schooling our children. Do not say you cannot school them, for you can. I understand that the other night there was a school meeting in one of the wards of this city, and a person there, a poor, miserable apostate, said, 'We want a free school, and we want to have the name of establishing the first free school in Utah.'" And then Brigham continues, "To call a person a poor, miserable apostate may seem like a harsh word, but what shall we call a man who talks about free schools and would have all the people taxed to support them, and yet would take his rifle and threaten to shoot the man who had the collection of the ordinary light taxes levied in this territory, taxes which are lighter than any levied in any other portion of the country?" Here's Brigham making a very libertarian point, right? Libertarians always arguing that laws are always enforced by a gun. Ultimately, that's what all laws, statutes, ordinances are boiled down to. And so you have to ask yourself with every question, is this something worth killing someone over if they disagree and defy? So he's making a pretty libertarian argument here. But he's basically calling upon the Latter-day Saints, especially the moms, like, you can do this. You should do it yourself. He was, another quote of his at the time, I am opposed to free education as much as I'm opposed to taking property from one man and giving it to another who knows not how to take care of it. I don't believe in allowing my charities to go through the hands of robbers who pocket 9/10 themselves and give 1/10 to the poor. Would I encourage free schools by taxation? No. So again, making a rather libertarian argument about the whole thing. But the idea here is that he and other leaders were recognizing that these non-sectarian and secular schools had a very particular aim, and that was to basically de-Mormonize the kids. It was the motive of the people involved was not simply to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? It was to propagandize the young. It was, in the words of that who just said it a minute ago, the bishop from the Episcopalian Church who set up the schools in Utah, right? Saying, like Horace Mann, that children are wax, they're pliable like plastic, we can mold their minds. That's what it was all about. That is why these government schools were set up. They were specifically why these government schools were set up, not for academic proficiency, but for indoctrination. Political and ideological indoctrination as much as theological indoctrination. No wonder the Catholics wanted to opt out and they set up their own schools, to the point where in 1922, other states were attempting this too, but in Oregon, there was a ballot initiative that was passed by like 55% or something like that by voters, 1922, to require compulsory government schooling. Now you may say, well, we have that all over the country, compulsory education, right? Well, no, this was different. Because it's one thing to have compulsory schooling. I don't say compulsory education because education can never be compulsory and it happens outside of school, and those two words don't make sense. The government's laws today and for a long time have been compulsory schooling. You must go to school. Whether or not you're educated is a separate question. So we have compulsory schooling all over the place. What's so different about this Oregon 1922 law? Well, as I said, it was compulsory government schooling. They were removing an exemption for private schools, specifically because in their case in Oregon, they were trying to go after the Black community that constituted only 8% of the population, who was one of the main proponents of the voter initiative. It was the Ku Klux Klan, right? There were all these individuals who wanted to take these different immigrants and these different cultures and turn the kids into a more homogenized, acceptable version. They wanted to discourage such families to move there. If they wanted private school, they wanted them to leave the state, right? And so it was a very kind of racist and bigoted approach, but yet it passed by a majority of voters in 1922 to require compulsory government schooling, no more private schools. This applied not only to the Catholic schools, it applied to other private schools. It applied to a military school at the time that was private. And so the Catholics, they end up suing. And they challenged this in court. It made its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which overturned the law, stating, among other things, that the child is not the mere creature of the state. That was one of the more compelling lines from that court case. A child is not the mere creature of the state. In other words, you can't just do what you want with kids. Like they're not a creature of the state. There's parental rights involved here. We have to be respectful of those and so forth. So that became a landmark ruling that allowed for private schools basically to be legal across the country and make sure that they remain an exemption to compulsory schooling. Homeschooling was a different question. It was still banned. Home education, it would take half a century more before that started to be legalized as a result of some court challenges and then legislative changes. But it's not about the academics. If anything, academics are secondary. You look at John Dewey. I mean, gosh, if you've never read, you can go pick up my book, Passion-Driven Education, where I talk about this, or go read John Taylor Gatto or other educational stuff about John Dewey. Here's a guy who's a secular, humanist, atheist, socialist, and he is this big evangelist for government schools and reshaping them to basically influence the minds of the young. He called teachers at one point prophets of the one true God. Well, why would an atheist say that if he doesn't believe in God? His God was literally the government. It was the collective, and Teachers were the ambassadors, the prophets, the emissaries to do the will of the collective and shape the minds of the young in furtherance and subservience to the collective. John Dewey's a scary individual. And so there's all these individuals out there who have architected the modern school system to produce a particular result. That result is not education excellence. I mean, it's just not. No matter which way you slice the data, America's schools do horrible. To the point where in 1983, some of you know this, I've shared this on Facebook because I'm writing a book about this right now. In 1983, there was a group of individuals who got together. They were kind of brought together by the U.S. Department of Education under the Reagan administration. And they were tasked with going across the country and holding focus groups and workshops and listening tours to try and assess how, like the state of schooling or education in America. How are the public schools doing, the curriculum, the teachers, the standards, and all of this? They spent a year and a half. They produced a report that was published April of 1983 titled A Nation at Risk. And among other things in the report, which, again, 40th anniversary is coming out, April. It's coming out here pretty quick, and that's why I'm working on this book with Corey DeAngelis. We're trying to have it done so that we can publish the book on the 40th anniversary of this report being published. It's a 36-page report. Here's a tiny little snippet that I most often share. They called it an open letter to the American people, and they write, among other things, the educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. I was speaking yesterday morning in South Dakota. I shared a little bit of this, and I do this often in various speeches that I give where I have occasion to share that. And I say, as I did yesterday, raise of hands, is there anyone in the room who would like to argue that America's schools are superior to what they were 40 years ago, that they're producing better educational outcomes for students? Yesterday's audience of, 200 plus, not a single soul. And in fact, every time I ask this to every audience, no one ventures to raise their hand because the question answers itself. The schools are doing, maybe in some aspects, better. You could argue here and there, right? But overall, it's a net negative. And so if at the time, 40 years ago, the assessment was that we had a rising tide of mediocrity, what's the assessment today? Now, I said at the beginning that I think that this is a desirable outcome for some. I think for the Horace Manns and the John Deweys, they wanted to produce individuals who were good little factory workers, good rule followers, submissive to the collective, subservient to authority, and that's what they've got. It's why when I spoke to a parents group, it was about a year ago, and a mom after raises her hand and vents about how the school system is quote unquote broken. And I had to pause and say, actually, with respect, I completely disagree. I think all the problems you're articulating, all these different, curriculum problems and sex ed and social and emotional learning and critical race theory and gender wars and everything else, I think a lot of this is outgrowth of a system that was designed a particular way, and that these things are features, not bugs, of that system. That what we're seeing today is an outgrowth of the way that the system was designed. I think that people in power prefer us to be ignorant. I mean, think of it. If you were tasked with ruling a country, right, or ruling over people, do you want them to be well-informed about their rights, familiar with history about all the times your predecessors in your position have, screwed over the people and taxed them to death and sent them to wars and all these things? Do you want them to be historically literate? Do you want them to be critical thinkers that evaluate what you tell them to do and challenge you and ask for sources and data and everything else, right? Do you want entrepreneurial people who can be economically independent and not depend on you, right? To subsidize them and to support them so that they owe you something and they remain docile and compliant? Like, of course, those in power prefer historically illiterate, uncritically thinking, dependent sheep. Who wouldn't in that role? Thomas Jefferson once said that timid men prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous sea of liberty. I think it's human nature for people to want comfort, to want security. But in the process, as Franklin said, we trade away, our liberty for security. And in the process, we have neither. 40 years ago, a rising tide of mediocrity, and today it's worse. And I think those in power are okay with it. They are okay with all the videos that you can find on YouTube of people being asked at, high school campus, basic civic questions that they've been taught for years in social studies, and they can't get it right. We laugh and ha ha ha, how dumb, and yet that is the output of this system. That is what this system is producing. I think Caesar wants ignoramuses. Caesar does not want us to learn, because by being ignorant, we are more easily controlled. God, on the other hand, wants us to learn. God wants us to be educated so that we are empowered. I mean, he literally says, obtain a knowledge of history and of countries and of kingdoms, of laws of God and man, and all this for the salvation of Zion. Right? He wants to save us. That's why he sent Jesus Christ. He wants our salvation. But part of that is predicated on obtaining a knowledge, the glory of God, intelligence. We have to understand this stuff. God wants to empower us, right? He wants us to acquire all knowledge. And the schools today are so ineffective at doing that. What's worse is that I think people have become habituated to the mediocrity. The rising tide of mediocrity that they warned about 40 years ago that is worse today, people don't see it as a rising tide. It's been slow and incremental, but also most people that have grown up today have grown up in an environment where the tide is really high. They know nothing else. They don't seek anything else. They don't study and critically analyze their environment to say, well, wait a minute, is this normal? Is this okay? Instead, it's, well, this is the way it's always been. And so they don't know any better, and they don't seek to understand any better. And they don't realize that the tide should not exist at all, right? That it certainly shouldn't be rising, and that these educational foundations of our society that they describe should not be submerged underwater. God doesn't want that. But Brigham Young lost. He lost. He pled with the people not to go to these free schools, and yet everyone wanted the free babysitting. They said, oh, we're being taxed already. We might as well benefit from this. They didn't recognize, now, I've got my quibbles with Brigham Young, but on this issue, he was right. Totally right. Especially his kind of libertarian quotes about how ineffective and counterproductive and immoral the taxation basis for this entire scheme was and is. Pleading with moms, you can do it. I mean, it's the same plea today. All these moms, I could never homeschool. I could never do that. I could never educate my own kids, right? It's what I've always done, public school. It's what I did growing up. It's all I know. I would never be able to do it. And here's Brigham pleading with the moms, don't tell me you can't do it, you can. Do not say you cannot school them, for you can. And I don't think he's wrong. And I think that if we don't try, if we don't rescue our children from these institutions that consider our theology a threat, that consider our worldview antiquated and unfounded and backwards and ridiculous, right? Why are we voluntarily sending our children to institutions created by, supported by, perpetuated by people who are completely hostile to the very values that we're trying to instill in our children? I mean, during their most intellectually formative years, to voluntarily send children into an environment of theological toxicity is mind-boggling. Here's President Packer. In many places, it is literally not safe physically for youngsters to go to school. And in many schools, and it's becoming almost generally true, it is spiritually unsafe to attend public schools. Look back over the history of education to the turn of the century and the beginning of the educational philosophies, which have led us now into a circumstance where our schools are producing the problems that we face. I'm Googling this on the fly to see when he said it. 1996, at a speech he gave at the David O. McKay Symposium, President Boyd K. Packer, spiritually unsafe to attend these schools, looking at the educational philosophies, the secular humanism, the socialism, the collectivism is what he's talking about, that have led us now to a circumstance where our schools are producing the problems that we face. What would life be like today if the Latter-day Saints had heeded the counsel of Brigham Young and avoided all the so-called free schools? What would it be like if people had listened to President Packer, if people realized how spiritually unsafe Caesar's schools truly are? Just as the early schools in the territory of Utah were trying to demormonize the kids and trying to influence them away from their parents by trying to argue that the plastic minds and wills of the young were what they could focus on to better mold them in nobler ways. My child is not up for the molding by people who despise what we stand for. I am not going to voluntarily surrender my child to my ideological opponent or theological opponent. And I don't even consider them necessarily opponents, but they definitely view me that way. Why would I give them access to my child's mind when their whole goal is to, like Hitler and all the rest before them, right? Well, I guess not before them. This Episcopal guy was before Hitler. But these people all throughout history have recognized that if they disagree with these adults, the best thing to do is to go after their kids. It's no different today. And yes, education is of God. And yes, he wants us to learn. And it's so critically important. But some of the best education happens outside of schooling institutions. And the schools themselves today, the government schools, do a piss-poor, sub-mediocre job at instilling the values that you and I want in our kids. Even on academics on its own, leave aside all the other values and things that you would want your children to be, raised with and taught about on a regular basis by adults you can trust. Leave aside all those secondary or additional values and things. Focus on academics itself. The schools are doing a miserable job. They just are. They're preparing kids for an economy that no longer exists. They're literally still conveyor belt factory schools built for an industrial age, not the knowledge economy, the information economy. I mean, I've been playing all weekend with AI, and AI is just going to massively disrupt so many institutions, occupations, tasks. It's pretty phenomenal, pretty exciting, pretty scary, and all the rest. But the point is that schools are doing bupkis about preparing children for a future economy. The world is so much different than it was 150 years ago, and yet these schools are still stuck in the same rut. Why? Because they're succeeding. They are okay with what's happening. They're not really that interested in preparing children for a future economy. They're not really interested in instilling the values you agree with your children. Ultimately, Caesar's schools prefer a predictable output of malleable individuals who will be submissive to the will of the collective and the rule by those in charge. That is the goal. That is the primary output. That is what has been happening for decades. That is why there is academic mediocrity, because it is not ultimately the goal. Which means that if you want something different for your children, then you need to think differently. You need to act differently. And maybe that means heeding the counsel of Brigham from 150 years ago and getting our kids out of the free schools and taking it upon ourselves, whether individually through homeschooling or organizing together through voluntary schooling institutions and private schools and co-ops. But the so-called free schools have always been a threat. They are today as much as they ever were. Despite the amazing teachers that I know who are in the system, they're still in a system. And that system has massive inertia and a history of substandard output that is not what I want for my kids. Whether you want it for yours, I leave to you and your family to decide. But the point is that education, I think, is too important to leave it up to government schools because they're doing an awful job. See you next week.